They gave up their bed so the millionaire's son could sleep, until he saw. Richard Sullivan had never imagined he would return from a business trip to find a scene that would change his life forever. The penthouse apartment was empty. The housekeeper had been let go weeks before, and his son Ethan was nowhere to be found. It wasn't until he went down to the basement of the apartment building that reality hit him like a punch to the gut. There was Ethan, his 8-year-old son, peacefully asleep in the only bed in Raymond the janitor's tiny apartment. The gray-haired man and his visibly pregnant wife Dorothy slept on the cold floor atop makeshift mats. Richard stood frozen in the slightly open doorway, staring in complete shock. Ethan clutched a worn teddy bear he'd never seen before, breathing softly under a carefully patched blanket. Dorothy had one hand resting on her rounded belly, while Raymond kept a protective arm around his wife. The businessman felt something strange tighten in his chest. When was the last time he'd seen Ethan sleep so peacefully? At the mansion, the boy always complained of nightmares, woke up crying in the middle of the night, begged not to be left alone. Here, in this small, simple space, he seemed utterly at ease. Raymond opened his eyes first, startled to see Richard at the door. The man quickly got up, trying not to wake his wife, and gestured for them to speak outside. Richard stepped back, letting the janitor slip out and close the door gently. "Mr. Sullivan, I can explain," Raymond whispered, clearly nervous. "The boy showed up here crying, said he'd run away from home. We tried calling you, but—" "How long has he been here?" Richard interrupted, his voice steadier than he expected. Raymond hesitated, running a hand through his gray hair. "This is the 4th time this week, sir. He comes whenever you're away, says he feels lonely up there." Richard felt as if the floor was shifting beneath his feet. 4th time? How had he not known? The housekeeper he'd fired over baseless suspicions of petty theft. She'd never mentioned Ethan leaving home. "He asked to stay tonight," Raymond continued. "My Dorothy couldn't bring herself to send him away, especially seeing how upset he was. We offered the sofa, but he insisted he wanted to share a bed with someone, said he was afraid of the dark." "And you slept on the floor for that?" Richard asked, disbelieving. Raymond shrugged, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "A child needs a good night's sleep, right? We're adults. We can manage." At that moment, Richard realized he knew nothing about the people who worked for him. How old was Raymond? How long had he worked in the building? And why was his pregnant wife sleeping on the floor to accommodate a child who wasn't even theirs? "May I come in?" Richard asked softly. "Richard." Raymond nodded, and the two stepped inside the small apartment. It was simple but spotless. Flowers sat in a makeshift vase, family photos lined the walls, and the comforting scent of homemade cake lingered in the air. Richard had never been down to the basement before, never cared to see how his employees lived. Dorothy stirred at the sound of their voices, sitting up slowly and placing a hand on her belly. She was around 40, her brown hair tied in a simple bun, her kind eyes filling with concern when she saw Richard. "Mr. Sullivan, I'm sorry about the situation," she began, trying to rise. "No, please stay seated," Richard said quickly. "I'm the one who should apologize. I had no idea Ethan was bothering you." "Bothering us?" Dorothy looked genuinely surprised. "On the contrary, sir. Ethan is a wonderful child. He helps us, talks with us, even helped me paint the nursery last week." Richard looked around and noticed small details that had previously gone unnoticed. Ethan's drawings taped to the wall, a school project on the kitchen table, a pair of small sneakers by the door. "Do you have children?" he asked, realizing he'd never asked that question in 5 years of working with Raymond. The couple exchanged a pained glance. Dorothy lowered her eyes and Raymond cleared his throat before answering. "We lost our first baby 3 years ago, sir. This pregnancy is our second chance." The silence that followed was heavy. Richard felt like a stranger in his own world, discovering stories of people who lived just a few feet away and about whom he knew nothing. "Does Ethan know?" he finally asked. "He does," Dorothy replied softly. "When he started coming here, he asked why we didn't have children. We told him the truth, adapted for his age, of course. He said he wanted to be our temporary child until the baby is born." Temporary child. The words echoed in Richard's mind. His own son was seeking a temporary family because his real one wasn't present. "May I sit?" Richard asked, pointing to a simple chair. "Of course, sir." Raymond pulled the chair out for him. Richard sat, feeling completely out of place in his $3,000 suit amid that humble setting. "Tell me about Ethan's visits. When did they start? How?" Dorothy and Raymond glanced at each other again, clearly hesitant. "You won't be angry?" Dorothy asked timidly. "I won't be angry," Richard assured, though he wasn't sure how he felt about anything at that moment. "It started about 2 months ago," Raymond explained. "You'd gone to Chicago, remember? Ethan came down to the lobby crying, said he was afraid to be alone. The housekeeper, well, she was always on the phone, didn't pay much attention." Richard remembered the trip. 3 days in Chicago closing an important deal. He'd called home only once, and Ethan had said everything was fine. "I brought him here for some hot chocolate," Dorothy continued. "He was shaking, said he'd heard strange noises in the apartment. He stayed until you got back." "And then?" Richard prompted. "Then he started coming down whenever he felt lonely," Raymond replied. "Always polite, always asking if he could stay a while. At first it was just for company, but little by little he started opening up," Dorothy finished. "He said he missed his mother, that he couldn't quite remember her face. He asked if all kids had parents who traveled so much." Richard swallowed hard. Ethan had barely known his mother, who'd passed away when he was just 2. Since then, Richard had thrown himself into work as a way to cope, leaving his son in the care of a string of nannies and housekeepers. "What kind of things do you do together?" he asked, genuinely curious. Dorothy's eyes lit up. "Oh, so many things. He helps me cook, loves making chocolate fudge. Raymond teaches him to fix little things, you know. Last week they fixed the kitchen faucet leak together. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now, continuing. He's very smart," Raymond added with evident pride. "Helps me with the building reports, has beautiful handwriting, and he's kind. Always asks how the baby is, if Dorothy isn't too tired." Richard felt a pang in his chest. When was the last time he'd asked how Ethan was doing in school, or if he'd made any new friends, or simply how his day had been? And today? "How was today?" he asked. Dorothy sighed. "Today he arrived later, after 10 at night. Said he'd tried to call you, but no one answered. He was crying a lot, saying he didn't want to sleep alone again." Richard checked his phone. 3 missed calls from Ethan, all during the business dinner he'd considered too important to interrupt. "We offered the sofa," Raymond explained, "but he asked to sleep with us. Said he wanted to feel like part of a real family. Since Dorothy is in her 3rd trimester, we thought it best for him to take the bed and us the floor." "You didn't have to do that," Richard murmured. "Yes, we did," Dorothy said firmly. "That boy needs to feel loved, to feel important to someone. A night on the floor is a small price to pay for that." Richard looked toward the bedroom door, where Ethan slept peacefully. How many nights had his son cried alone while he was in meetings, business dinners, trips that could have been postponed? "Can I see him?" he asked. "Of course." Dorothy rose slowly. "Just be careful not to wake him." It took him a while to fall asleep tonight. Richard followed Dorothy to the small room. Ethan looked just as he'd first seen him, clutching the worn teddy bear, breathing calmly. But now Richard noticed other details. The boy was smiling in his sleep, something he hadn't done in a long time at home. "Whose teddy bear is that?" he whispered. "It belonged to our first baby," Dorothy replied softly. "Ethan found it tucked away in the closet last week, asked if he could keep it, said the teddy needed someone to care for it too." Richard felt his eyes grow damp. His son was caring for a teddy bear that belonged to a child who never existed, in a family that wasn't his, sleeping in a borrowed bed from people he barely knew. "Why do you do this?" he asked when they returned to the living room. "Why care for him like this?" Raymond and Dorothy exchanged a glance, and she was the one who answered. "Because every child deserves to feel special to someone. And because, well, caring for Ethan helps us with our own grief, makes us feel like we're already parents in some way. Besides," Raymond added, He tells us about school, about his friends. He's a bright, funny kid. We're happy when he shows up." Richard ran a hand over his face, trying to process everything he was learning. "What does he say about school?" "Well," Dorothy hesitated. "Please tell me everything." "He struggles to make friends," Raymond said gently. "The other kids know he's wealthy, and it creates a barrier. Some tease him, say he thinks he's better than them." "And he never told me," Richard murmured. "He says he doesn't want to worry you, that you already have enough work problems," Dorothy explained. "Last week he came here with his uniform torn, said some boys pushed him at recess but begged us not to say anything." Richard closed his eyes, overwhelmed by guilt. While he worried about contracts and profits, his son was being bullied at school and suffering alone at home. "Is there anything else I should know?" he asked, bracing himself. Dorothy glanced at Raymond, who nodded slightly. "Ethan sometimes asks about his mother," she said gently. "Wants to know what she was like, if she'd have loved him, if she'd be proud. We tell him what we know, that she was beautiful, that she'd have loved him very much." "You knew my wife?" Richard asked, surprised. "Raymond told me," Dorothy explained. "He worked here when she was alive, said she was very kind, always greeted everyone, asked about the staff's families." Richard remembered Catherine. She really was like that, always interested in people, remembered the names of all the building employees, asked about their children, their problems. After she was gone, he closed himself off, built walls around himself and, without realizing it, around Ethan too. "Ethan asks if you miss her," Raymond said hesitantly. "And what do you tell him?" "That love never ends, even when people are gone," Dorothy answered. "And that sometimes adults struggle to show their feelings, but that doesn't mean they don't feel them." Richard stayed silent for a long moment. These simple people were offering his son the emotional wisdom he himself couldn't provide. "Can I ask you a personal question?" Richard finally said. "Of course," Raymond replied. "Do you need anything? For the baby, for yourselves? I'd like to help in some way." The couple exchanged glances again, and Richard noticed there was a silent communication between them, the kind only couples who truly know each other develop. "Actually," Dorothy said slowly, "there is one thing, but it's not money." "What is it?" "Ethan always asks when you'll have time to meet our baby when he's born. He really wants you to come visit, to see where he likes to spend time." Richard felt something break inside his chest. His son wanted to introduce him to the family he'd adopted, wanted him to meet the people filling the void he himself had created. "When is the baby due?" he asked. "In 6 weeks, if all goes well," Dorothy answered, placing a hand on her belly. "And do you have everything you need? Hospital, doctor, baby supplies?" Raymond looked down. "We're managing, sir. The health plan covers the basics, and with my salary we can buy what's most necessary." Richard knew Raymond's salary. It was fair by market standards, but certainly not enough to cover all the costs of a baby, especially since Dorothy didn't work outside the home. "I'd like to talk to you about this tomorrow," Richard said. "For now, I think it's best to let Ethan sleep. Can I pick him up in the morning?" "Of course," Dorothy said. "He usually wakes up early, likes to have breakfast with us before school." "Ethan has breakfast with you?" "Whenever he's here," Raymond confirmed. "He loves Dorothy's homemade bread, says it's better than the French bakery near your penthouse." Once again, Richard realized he didn't know what his own son liked to eat. Ethan always had breakfast alone, served by the housekeeper, while Richard read newspapers or took calls. "Can I ask one more thing?" Richard said. "Don't tell Ethan I came to get him. Let him tell me about you when he feels comfortable." "Why?" Dorothy asked, curious. "Because I want to understand what's happening here. I want to know why my son prefers sleeping in the basement to being at home." Raymond nodded understandingly. "You're always welcome here, Mr. Sullivan. Ethan talks about you a lot, you know. He's very proud to have an important father." "Important," Richard repeated bitterly, "but not present." "It's never too late to change that," Dorothy said gently. "Ethan is an understanding child with a big heart. I'm sure he'd be happy to spend more time with you." Richard stood up, feeling emotionally drained. "Thank you for taking care of him. I don't know how to thank you." "No need to thank us," Raymond said, walking him to the door. Taking care of those we love is never a burden. As he rode the elevator back to the penthouse, Richard reflected on Raymond's words. Taking care of those we love. When was the last time he'd truly taken care of Ethan? Not financially, he'd always done that, but emotionally, physically present, available. The penthouse apartment was silent and cold. Richard walked through the rooms, seeing them for the first time through the eyes of an 8-year-old child. It was luxurious, yes, but also empty. There were no photographs in prominent places, no sign that a child lived there beyond the expensive toys neatly arranged in a room that looked more like a showroom. He went to Ethan's room. The king-size bed was impeccably made. When had Ethan last slept in it? Richard opened the closets, seeing expensive clothes, the latest toys still in their packaging, everything money could buy. But there was nothing personal, nothing that showed the boy's personality. No drawings taped to the wall, no school projects in sight, no sign that a child truly lived there. Richard sat on the edge of the bed and for the first time in years, cried. He cried for Catherine, for Ethan, for himself. He cried for the lost time, the wasted opportunities, the nights Ethan had spent alone while he was building a better future for them both. The next morning, Richard cancelled all his meetings for the day. He went down to the basement at 7 in the morning, hearing laughter coming from Raymond's apartment even before he knocked on the door. "Dad?" Ethan opened the door, surprised and visibly nervous. "What are you doing here?" "I came to take you to school," Richard said, smiling. "And I wanted to meet your friends." Ethan looked back where Dorothy and Raymond were watching the scene with interest. "These are my friends," Ethan said softly. "Mr. Raymond and Mrs. Dorothy." "It's a pleasure to meet you," Richard said formally, stepping inside the apartment. "The pleasure is ours," Dorothy replied, offering him coffee. "Ethan was just telling us you got back from your trip yesterday." "Yes, and I realized I'd missed a lot of interesting things here at home," Richard said, looking at Ethan. "I heard you've been helping prepare the nursery?" Ethan's eyes lit up. "Do you want to see, Dad? It's turning out so nice." Richard followed his son to a corner of the apartment that had been converted into a small nursery. It was simple, but made with love. Ethan had painted clouds on the blue walls, and homemade mobiles hung from the ceiling. "You did this yourself?" Richard asked, genuinely impressed. "Mr. Raymond taught me," Ethan said proudly. "And Mrs. Dorothy showed me how to make the mobiles. She's really good at crafts." Richard looked at Dorothy, who smiled shyly. "You do crafts?" "It's a hobby," she explained. "It helps pass the time, and we sell some pieces at the church bazaar to make extra money." "May I see?" Richard asked. Dorothy showed him a collection of delicate work, crocheted dolls, patchwork quilts, simple but well-made decorative items. Richard was struck by the quality and care in each piece. "This is professional work," he said sincerely. "Mrs. Dorothy is the best," Ethan said. "She's teaching me how to make beaded bracelets. I want to make one for you, Dad." Richard felt his eyes well up again. "I'd love to have a bracelet made by you." They had coffee together, and Richard watched how Ethan behaved there. The boy was talkative, cheerful, helped serve the coffee, asked about the baby, told jokes. It was a version of Ethan Richard had never known. "Ethan," Richard said when they finished eating, "would you like me to take you to school today?" "You can," Ethan asked, surprised. "Don't you have meetings?" "I cancelled them," Richard replied. "I thought we could spend the day together. Maybe go out for lunch, visit the park, do some things you like." Ethan practically jumped with joy. "Really? I get to choose what we do?" "Of course." "And can I introduce you to my teachers?" Richard realized Ethan had never done that before. "I'd love to meet your teachers." While Ethan was getting ready for school, Richard quickly spoke with Raymond and Dorothy. "I'd like to talk with you both later," he said. "About Ethan, about you, about many things." "We'll be here," Raymond replied. "And thank you," Richard added, "for everything, for taking care of him, for showing me things about my own son that I didn't know." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps those of us just starting out. Now, continuing. The day with Ethan was eye-opening for Richard. At school, he discovered his son was popular with teachers but had few friends. During lunch, Ethan told him about the bullies, about feeling different, about wishing he had a normal family. "What's a normal family to you?" Richard asked. "A family that eats dinner together, talks about their day, that doesn't care if the house isn't perfect," Ethan answered. "Like Mr. Raymond and Mrs. Dorothy." "And what would our family need to do to be more normal?" Ethan thought carefully. "Maybe talk more? And you not travel so much? And maybe cook together sometimes? You'd like to cook with me?" Mrs. Dorothy says cooking with someone you love is one of life's greatest joys. That evening, instead of ordering Japanese food as usual, Richard and Ethan went to the supermarket together. Ethan picked out ingredients to make chocolate fudge, and they spent the evening cooking together, laughing at mistakes, celebrating successes. "Dad," Ethan said as they licked the fudge spoons, "can I ask you something?" "Of course. Why were you so sad after Mom left?" Richard froze, swallowing hard. It was the first time Ethan had asked directly about Catherine. "Because I loved your mother very much," he answered honestly. "And when someone you love leaves, it leaves a big hole in your heart. But I was here," Ethan said softly. Richard knelt beside his son, holding his small hands. "You were. And you've always been the most important thing in my life. I just didn't know how to show it after I got sad. Mrs. Dorothy says when you're sad, it's even more important to stay close to the people you love." "Mrs. Dorothy is very wise," Richard agreed. "Are you still sad?" Richard thought carefully. "I still miss your mother and I always will, but I'm not sad anymore. Not when I'm with you." Ethan smiled and hugged his father. "I'm not sad when I'm with you either." In the following days, Richard established a new routine. He worked from home in the mornings, picked Ethan up from school, and spent afternoons together. They often visited Raymond and Dorothy downstairs, and Richard got to know the couple better. He learned Raymond had an engineering degree, but lost his job during an economic crisis years earlier. Since then, he'd taken simpler jobs for stability. Dorothy had studied education, but stopped working to focus on her health during pregnancy. "Why didn't you ever tell me this?" Richard asked during one visit. "You never asked," Raymond answered without resentment. "Besides, we didn't think our story would interest you." "Of course it does," Richard said. "You're important people in Ethan's life. That makes you important to me too." Dorothy smiled. "Ethan always says you're a good man, just very busy." "Was very busy," Richard corrected. "I'm learning some things are more important than meetings." 3 weeks later, Dorothy went into labor in the early hours. Raymond knocked on Richard's door, nervous and worried. "Mr. Richard, sorry to bother you, but I need to take Dorothy to the hospital. Could you—" "Of course," Richard said immediately. "I'll drive you." "Ethan, wake up. Let's go help our friends." At Mercy General Hospital, they discovered the baby was coming early. Dorothy would need to stay hospitalized, and the delivery could be complicated. Raymond was beside himself, worried about expenses and potential complications. "Raymond," Richard said, pulling the man aside, "don't worry about money right now. Focus on Dorothy and the baby. I'll take care of the rest." "But sir, I can't accept—" "It's not charity," Richard interrupted. "It's family taking care of family." Ethan held Dorothy's hand as she was taken to her room. "Mrs. Dorothy, will the baby be okay?" "Yes, my dear," she said, smiling through the pain. "He'll be very loved, just like you." The next few hours were tense. Richard cancelled all his appointments for the week, staying at the hospital with Raymond and Ethan. He called the best doctors he knew, making sure Dorothy received the best possible care. "Why are you doing this?" Raymond asked during one of their long vigils in the waiting room. "Because you did something I could never do on my own," Richard replied. "You made my son truly smile. You made him feel loved, important. That's priceless." Ethan was asleep in an uncomfortable chair when the doctor finally arrived with good news. Dorothy was fine, and the baby, though premature, was healthy and strong. "It's a boy," the doctor announced. Raymond cried with relief and joy. Richard felt as if he were witnessing the birth of his own grandson. "What will you name him?" Ethan asked sleepily when he woke up. "Jacob," Dorothy answered when they were finally allowed to see her. "Like the angel who protects children." Ethan held the tiny baby with extreme care. "Hi, Jacob. I'm Ethan. I'm going to be your big brother, okay?" Richard watched the scene, moved. Ethan had found a family to love, and he had gained a new perspective on what truly mattered in life. In the following months, their lives intertwined naturally. Richard offered Raymond a better job, utilizing his engineering background at the company. Dorothy began working part-time developing educational projects for employees' children. Ethan split his time between both homes, now by choice, not necessity. The penthouse apartment was renovated to feel cozier, more like a home. Richard learned to cook, Ethan learned to talk about his feelings, and together they learned how to be a real family. "Dad," Ethan said one evening as they made popcorn for a movie night, "can I ask you something?" "Always." "Do you think Mom would be happy seeing how we are now?" Richard smiled, pulling his son into a hug. "I'm sure she would. She always said family wasn't about having a perfect house or lots of money. It was about love, companionship, being there for each other. So now we're a real family." "We've always been a family, Ethan. We just needed to learn how to be a good one. And Mr. Raymond, Mrs. Dorothy, and Jacob, are they our family too?" "If you want them to be." "I do," Ethan said firmly. "I like having a big family." "Me too," Richard agreed. That night, as Ethan slept peacefully in his own bed, Richard reflected on how much his life had changed. Just weeks ago, he was a successful businessman, but an absent father. Now he was a more complete man, one who had learned that true wealth wasn't in million-dollar contracts, but in simple moments with those he loved. He went down to the basement to check on Jacob, who still woke several times at night. He found Raymond pacing with the baby, trying to get him to sleep. "Need help?" Richard offered. "Sure," Raymond said, passing the baby to him. "You have a knack for this." Richard gently rocked Jacob, humming a song he used to sing to Ethan when he was a baby. The boy quickly calmed down. "You know," Raymond said quietly, "I never imagined my life would change so much because of a janitor job." "Neither did I imagine my life would change because of a child sleeping in the basement," Richard replied. "Sometimes the best things in life come when we least expect them," Raymond observed. "And sometimes they're right in front of us, but we're too busy to notice." Dorothy appeared in the doorway, smiling as she watched the two men tending to the baby. "You make a good team," she said softly. "We make a good family," Richard corrected. Months passed, and the unusual dynamic became completely natural. Ethan helped care for Jacob like a devoted older brother. Richard and Raymond developed a solid friendship, built on mutual respect and shared love for the children. Dorothy became a mother figure to Ethan, who finally had someone to talk to about his fears, dreams, and discoveries. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now continuing. Jacob's first birthday was celebrated in the penthouse apartment, which Richard had transformed into a warm, family-friendly space. Ethan helped organize the party, inviting some schoolmates he'd finally managed to get close to. "Look, Jacob," Ethan said, holding his honorary brother in his arms. "This is our family. It's different, but it's ours." Richard watched the scene, Ethan laughing with friends, Raymond helping at the grill, Dorothy arranging gifts, Jacob giggling in his big brother's arms. It was exactly the kind of joyful chaos Catherine had always said she wanted in their home. "I think she'd approve," he murmured to himself. "Who'd approve?" Ethan appeared beside him. "Your mother. I think she'd approve of our crazy family." Ethan smiled. "I think so too. Mrs. Dorothy says love doesn't take up space. The more you love, the more room there is in your heart. Mrs. Dorothy is very wise indeed. Dad, can I tell you something?" "Always. I don't miss having a mom anymore. I mean, I still miss my real mom, but I don't feel alone anymore." Richard hugged his son, moved, "And I don't feel lost anymore. Having you all in my life reminded me what really matters." "What really matters?" "Being present, loving without fear, and never forgetting that family isn't just about blood, but about who chooses to stand by your side." 2 years later, Richard was at Mercy General Hospital again, but this time for a very different reason. Dorothy had given birth to their second child, a girl they named Hope. Now we have 3 kids to take care of, Raymond said, exhausted but happy. 3 children, Richard corrected. Ethan, Jacob, and Hope. Our family has grown. Ethan, now 10, held Jacob in his arms as they watched their newborn sister through the maternity ward window. "She's beautiful," Ethan whispered. "I'll teach her everything, just like Mr. Raymond taught me." "And I'll help," Jacob said in his 2-year-old voice. "I'll be the best brother in the world." Richard smiled, remembering that night that changed everything. If he hadn't gone down to the basement looking for Ethan, if he hadn't seen that touching scene of a humble couple giving up their own bed to shelter a lonely child, his life would still be empty and his priorities completely misplaced. "What are you thinking about?" Dorothy asked, approaching with Hope in her arms. "About how life can change completely in a single night," Richard replied. "Life always changes," she said wisely. "The question is whether we're open to noticing and accepting these changes." "You taught me to be open," Richard admitted. "Before, I thought I knew everything, that I had control over everything. You showed me that the best things in life happen when we stop trying to control and simply love." Raymond joined the group, putting his arm around his wife. "And you taught us that kindness begets kindness, that when we open our hearts, beautiful things happen." "You saved our family," Richard said. "Ethan and I were lost, each in our own loneliness. You showed us how to be a real family." "We saved each other," Dorothy corrected. "That's the beauty of a true family. No one saves anyone alone. Everyone takes care of everyone." Ethan looked at the group of adults, then at the babies. "You know what I think is the coolest thing about our family?" "What?" everyone asked. "That it started with a sad boy who just didn't want to sleep alone. And now look how many people we have to love." Richard laughed, pulling them all into a group hug. "And to think I almost lost all this because I was always traveling, always busy." "But you didn't," Raymond said. "And that's what matters." 5 years had passed since that night that changed everything. Ethan, now a 13-year-old teenager, was still the protective and caring big brother. Jacob, at 3 years old, was a happy and clever child who loved helping his father Raymond with small repairs around the house. Hope, also 3, was the family's princess, spoiled by everyone but still sweet and generous. Richard had sold several of his business ventures, keeping only those that truly inspired him and allowed him quality time with his family. Raymond had become a partner in a small engineering consulting firm they started together. Dorothy developed an innovative educational project being implemented in several schools across the city. "Dad," Ethan said one afternoon as he helped Richard review some contracts in the home office, "can I ask you something kind of personal?" "Of course," Richard replied, as always. "Do you think if my mom hadn't... if she was still here, our family would be different?" Richard stopped writing, carefully considering the question. It was the first time Ethan had reflected so deeply on what life might have been like if Catherine was still alive. "It probably would be different," he answered honestly. "Your mother was an incredible person, full of love and energy. Our life would have been more colorful from the start, for sure." "But do you think we would have met Mr. Raymond and Mrs. Dorothy the same way?" Richard thought. "Maybe not in the same way. You probably wouldn't have felt the need to look for a family in the basement if your mum were here, and I might not have buried myself in work so much. So maybe some bad things happen so good things can happen too?" Ethan asked, trying to understand life's complexity. "I don't think bad things happen for a specific reason," Richard said carefully. "I think they just happen. But I do think we have choices in how we respond. We can let them destroy us, or we can try to find something good in the pain." "And did you find something good?" "I found many good things. I learned to be a better father to you. I learned that family can take many different shapes. I found true friends. And most of all, I learned that love doesn't shrink when it's shared, it multiplies." Ethan smiled. "Mrs. Dorothy always says that. Mrs. Dorothy is a very wise woman." "Dad, there's one more thing I wanted to say." "Go ahead." "I was thinking, when I grow up, I want a family like ours. It doesn't matter if it's by blood or by heart. I want it to be full of love and people who care about each other." Richard felt his eyes grow moist. "I'm sure you'll achieve that. You already have so much love to give, Ethan. Any family would be lucky to have you." And when Jacob and Hope grow up, I'll teach them everything you taught me. About being present, about not being afraid to love, about taking care of each other. That makes me very proud, Richard said, hugging his son. That evening during family dinner, now a sacred tradition that happened every night without exception, Jacob made an important announcement. I have something to say, the 3-year-old declared solemnly. What is it, sweetheart? Dorothy asked. Today at school, the teacher asked how many siblings I have. I said I have 2. But then she asked if we all have the same mum and dad. Richard and Raymond exchanged glances, curious where this was going. And what did you say? Ethan asked. I said my brother Ethan has a different dad, but it doesn't matter because we love each other the same. And that family isn't about sharing the same blood, it's about sharing the same heart. Dorothy pressed a hand to her chest, moved. Hope, still too young to fully understand, clapped because she saw everyone smiling. What did the teacher say? Richard asked. She said I was right, and that I'm lucky to have such a special family. You really are, Raymond said, ruffling his son's hair. We all are. You know what I think is the most amazing thing? Ethan said. It all started because I was afraid to sleep alone, and now we're never alone. And you never will be, Richard promised, because once you're part of this family, it's forever. Forever and then some, Dorothy added, a phrase that had become their family motto. Forever and then some, they all repeated in unison, including Hope in her tiny voice. After dinner, while the children played in the living room and Dorothy tidied the kitchen, Richard and Raymond stepped out onto the penthouse balcony. Did you ever imagine your life would turn out like this when you took the janitor job here? Richard asked. Raymond laughed. Never. I was just trying to survive, to make sure Dorothy and I had a roof over our heads. I never thought I'd find a family, and I never thought I'd find mine in the basement of my apartment building. Life's funny that way, Raymond mused. Sometimes what we need most is right in front of us, but we don't see it until we're desperate enough to really look. Do you think we're good fathers? Richard asked. All these kids depend on us, and I'm still afraid of making the same mistakes I did with Ethan in those early years. I think the fact that you're asking yourself that is half the battle, Raymond replied. Parents who worry about being good parents usually are good parents. I hope you're right. Look at them. Raymond pointed inside, where Ethan was helping Jacob with a puzzle, while Hope helped by scattering the pieces. Look how they love each other, how they take care of one another. That doesn't happen by accident. It happens because they feel love and security at home. Richard watched the scene and had to agree. The children were happy, safe, and affectionate with each other. They had learned that love wasn't a limited resource, but something that grew the more it was shared. Raymond, Richard said, can I ask you something I've always wanted to ask? Of course. Do you regret anything? How your life changed, the choices you made? Raymond thought carefully. I regret losing our first baby, but I don't regret anything that happened after that. Losing that child taught us to cherish every moment we have with Jacob and Hope, and taking care of Ethan prepared us to be real parents. I regret missing Ethan's early years, Richard admitted, but I'm grateful for the chance to make up for lost time. And I'm grateful you all cared for him when I didn't know how. We all did the best we could with what we knew at the time, Raymond said wisely. What matters is that we learned and changed. That's true. Richard, can I tell you something? Of course. That first night when Ethan showed up here crying, Dorothy and I stayed up talking after he fell asleep. We were so afraid of losing another child, so scared to get attached and be hurt again. But that boy needed so much love. And you gave him love, despite your fear. We gave love because of the fear, because we understood how precious it is to have someone to love and be loved by. And because we realized that fearing love is worse than the pain of eventually losing it. Richard nodded, understanding perfectly. That's what I learned too. After Catherine passed, I thought it would be safer not to get too attached to Ethan, not to show too much love. So if something happened to me, it would hurt him less. But you found out you were wrong. I found out I was completely wrong. I learned that the love we give is the only thing that truly lasts. Children carry it with them for life. using it to love others, to build their own families. Exactly. Ethan will be an amazing father one day because he learned what unconditional love feels like. And so will Jacob and Hope. Absolutely. They fell silent for a moment, watching the city light up in the night. It was a beautiful view from the penthouse, but Richard knew the loveliest sight was inside the apartment, an improvised yet solid family, built on love, respect, and mutual dedication. "Raymond," Richard finally said, "thank you." "For what?" "For teaching me how to be a father, for caring for Ethan when I didn't know how, for showing me that family is about choice, not just blood, for letting me be part of something bigger than myself." "Richard, thank you too." "For what?" "For giving us stability when we needed it, for treating our children as your own, for showing us that kindness exists everywhere, even in people who seem very different from us." "I'd say we got a good deal," Richard said, smiling. "The best deal of our lives." They went back inside, where Dorothy was telling a bedtime story to the three children. It was a made-up tale about a family of different animals who meet in the forest and decide to live together. "And they lived happily ever after?" Hope asked in her sleepy voice. "They were happy while they lived," Dorothy gently corrected, "because they understood that what matters isn't living forever, but living with love." "Like our family," Jacob said. "Exactly like our family," Dorothy confirmed. After the children went to bed, the four adults sat in the living room to talk, as they did every night. "You know," Dorothy said, "sometimes I think about telling our story to someone. No one would believe it." "Why?" Ethan asked, appearing in his pajamas. "Can I get some water?" "Of course, sweetheart," Richard said. "And why wouldn't anyone believe it?" "Because it sounds like a movie," Ethan replied, pouring himself a glass. "A rich boy who runs away to the janitor's place, a businessman who becomes a better person, a family made up of completely different people." "But it happened," Raymond noted. "It happened because we all chose to make it happen," Richard added. "There were many moments when any one of us could have given up, could have chosen the easier path, but we all chose to stay, to fight for this family." "And it was hard sometimes," Dorothy admitted, "especially at the beginning when we were all learning how to navigate this unusual situation. But it was worth it," Ethan said, sitting on the arm of Richard's chair. "Because now I know I'll never be alone. I'll always have you." "And we'll always have you," Richard replied, hugging his son. "Can I sleep in the living room tonight?" Ethan asked. "Not because I'm scared, but because I want to be close to you." "Of course," everyone answered at the same time, laughing at the synchronization. "I'll get blankets," Dorothy said. "I'll help," Raymond offered. "And I'll make popcorn," Richard added. "And I'll pick the movie," Ethan shouted excitedly. An hour later, they were all settled in the living room, watching a family movie while eating popcorn. Jacob and Hope had woken up from the commotion and joined the group, all huddled together on the couches under blankets. "This is my favorite part of having a big family," Ethan murmured sleepily. "What part?" Richard asked softly. "The part where everyone stays together, unhurried, just enjoying each other's company." Richard looked around. Raymond was asleep with Hope in his arms. Dorothy had Jacob resting on her shoulder. Ethan was curled up beside him. It was a beautiful, cozy mess, exactly the kind of loving chaos he had missed in his early years of fatherhood. "I love that part too," he whispered to Ethan. "Dad?" "Yes?" "Thank you for coming down to look for me that night." "Thank you for giving me a reason to come down. We'll always take care of each other, right?" "Always," Richard promised. "Forever and then some. Forever and then some," Ethan repeated, already half asleep. Richard stayed awake a little longer, watching his makeshift family sleep around him. He thought about how life can change drastically in just moments, how a single decision can alter the course of so many lives forever. If he hadn't gone down to the basement that night looking for Ethan, if he hadn't seen that touching scene of a couple giving up their own bed to welcome a lonely child, where would they all be now? Ethan would probably still be a sad, isolated boy. Raymond and Dorothy would still be struggling alone with financial hardships. Jacob and Hope wouldn't have an older brother to look after them, and he himself would still be a wealthy but empty man, working non-stop to fill a void that money could never fill. But that's not what happened. Instead, they all found something they didn't even know they were searching for: a real family, built on unconditional love, mutual sacrifice, and the daily choice to care for one another. Richard closed his eyes, finally at peace with himself and his choices. For the first time in years, he wasn't worried about meetings the next day, contracts to sign, or business trips. He was simply grateful to be surrounded by people he loved and who loved him back. The next morning, they all woke up together in the living room, a human pile of blankets and sleepy smiles. Dorothy made coffee for everyone, Ethan helped with breakfast, Raymond played with Jacob and Hope, and Richard just watched, marveling at the imperfect perfection of his life. "You know what we're doing today," he announced. "What?" everyone asked curiously. "We're going to the park, having a picnic, playing on the playground, and not worrying about anything except being together." "Really?" Ethan asked excitedly. "You don't have meetings?" "Meetings can wait," Richard said. "Family can't." And so they did. They spent the entire day at the park, playing, laughing, talking, simply enjoying each other's company. Richard realized he hadn't checked his phone once, and he didn't miss it. "Dad," Ethan said as they pushed Jacob and Hope on the swings, "this was one of the best days of my life." "Mine too," Richard agreed. "Why?" "Because today I completely understood what it means to be happy. It's not about having a lot of money or success. It's about having people you love and who love you back. It's about being present for the important moments. It's about choosing love every day. Mrs. Dorothy always says happiness isn't a place you arrive at. It's a path you choose. Mrs. Dorothy is right. And we chose the right path. All of us did. End of story. Now, tell me what you thought of this story and where you're following us from. How did it feel discovering how Richard found his true family? Do you believe love can transform lives this way? Leave your honest comment and don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel for more heartwarming stories like this one.